Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the situation on the ground, and first we're going to start with the southern directions where the Russians continue their offensive operation both in the Orekhov direction and the Gulipolia direction. When talking about the territory around the settlement of Orekhov, during the previous 24 hours, according to several sources, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. According to several pro-Russian experts, after very heavy artillery preparation, the Russians began fast lightning attack, and as a result of this offensive operation, the Russians entered the territory of former prison on the territory of the settlement of Takmachka. So based on this, report, we haven't adjusted anything. We are waiting for additional and more reliable reports, but you know that we are not, surprised with this situation, because since the beginning of June, the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory heavily. We have lots of videos how the Russians were attacking the territory of the former prison. We're talking about this area. We have a lot of videos how the Russians were attacking the western and the northwestern part of the settlements with 12 tower system, with FAPs and many other different types of calibers. So the Ukrainians most likely expected that the Russians would attack, but most likely the Ukrainians didn't expect that the Russians would be so successful. So as for now, we're not adjusting the map. Once again, we are waiting for additional proofs, but obviously if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this former prison, then most likely we can start counting days when the entire settlement of Takmachka falls in Russian hands, because this former prison is the probably biggest stronghold in this area, and who controls this stronghold, who controls this former prison, controls the entire Takmachka. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but during the previous 24 hours, the Russians began their offensive operation not just in the direction of Takmachka. According to information we have, currently the Russians are trying to attack the city of Orekhov from the southwest and the settlement of Novodanilovka from the southwest as well. From this area we got lots of icons how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions in these fields. This obviously looks like artillery preparation before offensive operation. Currently there are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are showing fierce resistance. Anyway, let's wait and see whether the Ukrainians are able to hold their lines. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of Gulipolia. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the area of Gulipolia, and since the beginning of June, there were very heavy clashes between the settlements of Novozlatopol and the village of Malinovka. And based on reports that were published by different sources during the previous days, we adjusted the territory and tree lines in the fields around the village of Malinovka. Furthermore, we have report from pro-Ukrainian sources, and according to them, the Russians made lots of attempts to attack Malinovka, but all those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. So as for the end of the 11th of June of 2025, we have colored tree lines around the settlement of Malinovka to the south and to the southeast in Russian favor, based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian units along these tree lines. Several episodes of this video were geolocated and added to map. So based on this video, we adjusted the map. We see that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the southeastern part of Malinovka, but as for the end of the 11th of June of 2025, we haven't received anything that can confirm that the Russians managed to answer the village itself. Now we are going to talk about the most important direction, the Dnipro direction, because the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions significantly. Furthermore, we got several very interesting reports that were published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. Now, first, before we start, let's take a look at this map, and the first thing that, we can see is huge number of icons in the fields between the settlements of Odradne, Bogatyr, Alexeyevka, Novopavlovka, Goryokhova. So lots of icons. As you can see, the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory with FAPs, with artillery, with aviation, with FPV drones, and the Russians carry out several offensive operations. So now we see that the Russians began their major offensive operation in this direction, and obviously the Russians are tasked to answer the Dnipropetrovsk region and to begin offensive operation in new oblast of Ukraine. So now let's start from the beginning, and first let's talk about the statements that were made by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. So the Russians first made this statement. According to information we have, according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, the group of forces center continued to advance to the depth of the Ukrainians' defense. Units of the 55th Motorized Rifle Brigade have reached the western border of the Donetsk People Republic, and together with assault detachments of the 19th Tank Division continue offensive operation in the Dnipropetrovsk region. So the Russians of the group of forces center, first of all, it's very important to understand where is the border of the zones of, let's say, responsibilities between the group of forces center and the group of forces east. And according to my understanding of the situation, the border between two, let's say, zones of responsibility, zones of offensive, goes exactly along the river of Volcha. So this is the river of Volcha, and to the south of the river of Volcha is the area of responsibilities of the group of forces east, which currently attacks in the direction of Kamar, in the direction of the settlement of Gulipolia, in the direction of the settlements of Shevchenka. So everything to the south is the area of responsibility of the group of forces east. Everything to the north is the area of responsibilities of the group of forces center. Once again, group of forces center, more precisely the 55th Motorized Rifle Brigade and 19th Tank Division, managed to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region, and the Russians continue their offensive operation. And most likely the Russians were talking about Russian offensive operation to the northwest of the settlement of Goryokhova. During the previous days we got lots of videos, lots of proofs that confirm Russian control over the border between regions, and when talking about the 11th of June of 2025, today several neutral mappers adjusted their maps in Russian favor by coloring additional tree line along the border in Russian favor. So we believe that the Russians, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, were talking exactly about this area. And now we see that the Russians continue consolidation of their troops along the border, and currently the Russians trying to establish control over the border of the length of 5 kilometers, which will allow them to concentrate a critical mass, and then the Russians using this critical mass can continue moving further in the western direction towards the settlement of Novopavlovka. So anyway, based on this report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we haven't adjusted anything. They just confirm facts that we got during the previous days. Another important statement was made right after by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, and according to the next statement, as a result of intensive actions, units of the group of forces east have reached the western border of the Donetsk People's Republic and are developing an offensive on the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. So during the previous 24 hours, during the previous days, the group of forces center was not the only group of forces that managed to cross the border between Donetsk People's Republic and the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and according to information today, the group of forces east managed to do this as well. So when talking about the area of responsibilities of the group of forces east, there are several possible positions and areas where the Russians managed to cross the border. The first one, as you can see, we have added to map because we believe that this is exactly the area where the Russians managed to do this. The Russians crossed the border while they were attacking from the settlement of Odradna in the northern direction, and according to information we have and several experts, the Russians crossed the border exactly along the river of Volcha to the west of the settlement of Novoukrainka. So approximately this is exactly the route of Russian attack, and as a result of offensive operation, first of all, the Russians managed to outflank from the west the settlement of Novoukrainka, Zelený Kut, and the village of Alexeyevka itself, and at the same time the Russians managed to cross the border, and the Russians continue offensive operation deep inside of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation on the end of the 11th of June of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 10th of June. So we can see the gap, the adjustments are very huge, as you can see, and these adjustments once again were made based on the Minister of Defense report and based on several mappers that adjusted their maps in this area as well. So when talking about geolocations and videos, we haven't received anything that can confirm this progress on the ground, and now we are coming to another part, that there is another place where the Russians of the group of forces east could cross the Dnipro region, and this territory is located in the vicinity of Zelené Polye and Novopol. When talking about this part, this is exactly the border. This is the border between Dnipropetrovsk region and Donetsk region. So this is exactly the line that the Russians could cross as well during the previous 24 hours. In this case, the Russians could do this by attacking from the settlement of Gulipolia in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Novoenergiivka. So maybe this is the case. As for now, we don't know for sure. As for now, we are waiting for additional updates. But once again, we came to conclusion that this is exactly where it happened, because currently the Russians are attacking exactly in this direction. And if you remember, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Alexeyevka. I'll remind you that just yesterday, the units of the 114th Brigade of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation published this video where we can see how Russians raised their Russian flags all over the entire village along the southern line. So in this video we can see at least 4 flags, 4 signs of unit of 114th Brigade that were raised in different parts of the settlement. In the final part of this video we can see approximately the places where the Russians did this. So based on this video we have adjusted yesterday the most southeastern part of the settlement, and today several mappers adjusted the map further in the western direction. According to, let's say, neutral mappers, by the end of the 11th of June of 2025 the Russians managed to establish complete control over this village, and most likely this happened first of all due to Russian pressure in this area. But from the other side we see that by Russian offensive operation in the northern direction the Russians managed to cut almost the only line of supply and support for the Ukrainians in this area. We are talking about this road that goes from the settlement of Alexeyevka through the villages of Zelený Kut, Novoukrainka, Dachne, and further in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Novopoltavka. And according to the Minister of Defense, according to different mappers, this road was cut by the Russians during the previous 24 hours. Obviously, the Ukrainians are no longer able to use this road, so that is why we expect that Ukrainians would try to evacuate themselves through the fields in the northwestern direction using these roads for evacuation. But there is one huge problem for the Ukrainians, and the problem is that the Russians established complete FPV drone control exactly along these fields. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we got dozens of icons and dozens of videos exactly from this area. We managed to geolocate just few of them. Not every single video from this area was geolocated, but the number of videos that were geolocated is enough to make a conclusion that the Russians established complete FPV drone control over the only evacuation road for the armored forces of Ukraine that are currently located on the territory of the villages of Alexeyevka, Zelený Kut, Novoukrainka, and this network of the fortifications. And obviously the Ukrainians have just one chance, just one opportunity to evacuate themselves, and obviously this upcoming night is the only window of opportunities for the armored forces of Ukraine, because while the Russians, at the same time while the Russians are moving from the south in the direction of the north, the armored forces of the Russian Federation during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions to the south of the village of Goryokhove and to improve their positions also in the vicinity of this, the only one evacuation road. We came to this conclusion based on the geolocations and different articles that were published by different sources. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 10th of June, and this is the situation by the end of the 11th of June of 2025. The Russians improved their position significantly in this area. This was confirmed by neutral mappers and by several geolocations that were published by the Ukrainians. We're not going to watch all these videos because we have a lot of violence and casualties among soldiers in this area. So this is the situation on the ground, and we see that the news around Ukrainian positions on the territory of this dense network of the fortifications is tightening, and obviously we see, and it's clear that during the next several days the Russians will maintain their lines. They will shorten their lines between the settlements of Kamar, Novoukrainka, and Goryokhove. So all these territories would be taken by the Russians during the next probably 72 hours or something like this. The Ukrainians are retreating, and probably the biggest evacuation of their personnel we're going to face during the upcoming night. When talking about the settlement of Kamar, there are still very heavy clashes in this area. During the previous 24 hours, according to different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions. Several pro-Russian resources reported that by the end of the 11th of June of 2025, the Russians established control for more than, let's say, 30% of the settlement in the south and in the southeastern direction. At the same time, the Russians are bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions to the north and to the northwest of the settlement of Kamar and Odradne using FABs and TOS flamethrower systems. So obviously we can say that the Russians began their major offensive operation, and the Russians are tasked to answer the Dnipro region and to advance as deep as possible on the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. As for now, it's very difficult even to say where exactly the Russians are planning to stop. Maybe the Russians are going to stop only there where Ukrainians are able to stop them. And when talking about this option, obviously it's nobody knows for sure where exactly the Ukrainians are able to do this. Maybe the Ukrainians are able to do this along the river of Dnipro, who knows. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation about the northern flank. Today we got several geolocations from the villages of Novonikolaevka and Muravka. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians on the territory of the settlement of Novonikolaevka. Video has 46 seconds length, and during this video we can see lots of strikes, how Ukrainians were attacking Russian positions. At least according to this author, the Ukrainians were attacking Russian positions. Both several episodes, and several of them took place exactly along these two icons. One of the strikes took place exactly in this area, another one took place here. Based on this video we have adjusted the map, and most likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm that the Russians established complete control over this territory. And I would like to remind you that just yesterday we discussed this video where Russian bikers were attacking the territory of Novonikolaevka from the southwest. In this video we can see how Russian bikers were advancing through the fields under very heavy artillery fire from the armored forces of Ukraine, and in this very moment we see how the Russians were entering the southwestern part exactly in this point. So maybe the Russians, yes, there was a turning point in the battle for the settlement. Maybe when the Russians on bikers managed to answer the settlement, the Ukrainians probably decided to fall back due to this situation. So very interesting and very effective tactics with bikers, and the Russians continue developing these tactics and improving their positions using it. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Pokrovsk, because during the previous 24 hours we continue receiving videos and different updates exactly from the southern and the southeastern part of the city. In this video, for example, we can see how Russians managed to discover the temporary deployment points of the armored forces of Ukraine, and then how the Russians destroyed them with artillery strikes and with aviation and FPV drones. So as from this perspective, just a regular video, nothing special, but the most important thing is that we haven't received almost anything from the city of Pokrovsk for probably 2 months in a row. So just several updates and so on. But when talking about latest days, when talking about, let's say, June, the most important updates and the most interesting videos are coming from the southern direction. We are talking about these territories. So as you can see, the Russians established certain fire control over this territory, and the Russians are attacking this territory not just with drones or something like artillery. The Russians are pummeling this territory with very heavy calibers like TOS flamethrower systems, like FABs, and many other different types of weapon, which means that the Russians are trying not just to bomb Ukraine positions, the Russians are trying to reduce this road of possible attack till ruins, which will allow the Russians without any resistance and without any barriers to move from the settlement of Dachinske using M30 road in the northern direction. I'm not saying that the Russians are going to answer the settlement of Pokrovsk itself, but obviously using biker tactics, the Russians can answer the village of Novopavlovka from the west and to hold these territories for as long as possible, while the main and major Russian army is moving from the south in the northern direction, clearing this territory from Ukrainian forces. Everything is possible, and we expect that something huge might happen in this area. At the same time, this offensive operation could be very useful for you Russians in case if they continue offensive operation on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk, of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians are trying to improve their positions in the area of Malinovka. The Russians during the previous 24 hours, according to different sources, improved their positions in the vicinity of Koptiva. According to several sources, both villages were taken by the Russians completely, and that the Russians continued their offensive. And obviously this is not something like a regular offensive operation. Obviously this is something like outflanking maneuver with the purpose to establish complete control or complete encirclement of the city of Pokrovsk itself. So obviously if the Russians are able to get some results in the southern part of Pokrovsk, this will force the Ukrainians to consolidate their units in this area, and the Ukrainians would be forced to use a lot of units and forces exactly in the southern part of the city with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back and to stabilize the situation. And this can allow the Russians to continue offensive operation on the eastern flank. So everything is complicated, and obviously it's time for decisions, very difficult and very hard decisions for both the Russians and for the Ukrainians. Now let's move to the Konstantinovka direction, where the Russians began another Cauldron operation. As for now, the Russians are going to establish or to cut some Cauldron the Ukrainians that are currently located on the territories of the villages of Novospaska, Sherbinovka, Kleban-Byk and Katerinovka. So for these purposes, the Russians are trying to cut main supply lines. As for the end of the 11th of June of 2025, the Ukrainians still have possibilities, probably with losses, with huge losses, to use an 20 road between the settlement of Konstantinovka and Katerinovka. This is the first supply road, and this is the second supply road that Ukrainians still have possibilities to use for these purposes. And the Russians are shortening the distance to these two roads every single day, both from this western and from the eastern directions. When talking about the western direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians secured additional stronghold in this area, and the Russians continue offensive operation. When talking about this direction, the distance to the supply line and the Kleban-Byk water reserve is still huge, but the Russians are shortening this distance every single day. At the same time, the Russians are trying to get to the water reserve from the southwest using these fields for offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, this information was confirmed by several mappers and by pro-Ukrainian resources. So this is another way how to shorten the distance to the water reserve and to the road N20. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation to the northwest of the city of Donetsk, and here we can see how Russians were securing these territories. There were very heavy clashes, and most likely the Russians managed to capture this stronghold. Now the Russians will regroup, and then they will finish moving further in the western direction with the purpose to cut this 0522 road. And the most important thing is that currently we start receiving lots of videos of FPV drone attacks in the area of possible Cauldron. We have the Russians deployed additional FPV drone operators in this area, and now the Russians are attacking and bombing Ukrainian units. So the Russians are trying to pin Ukrainians down in this direction with the purpose not to allow them to evacuate themselves when time comes. So the most important part of the battle for the Kleban-Byk pocket has begun, and the Russians will continue increasing their pressure. When talking about the city of Chasiv Yar during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were mainly focused on developing their foothold along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. According to information we have, the Russians managed to secure several dams and the network of the fortifications to the southeast of Belagora. In this video we can see a Russian soldier that was moving along this tree line. Based on this video we have adjusted these territories. Several mappers have already cut this pocket completely in Russian favor. So summarizing everything, according to several sources, everything to the southeast of this red line is already under complete Russian control. We are talking about this pocket. At the same time, according to information we have, the Russians are trying to advance in the northern direction and the northwestern direction from the city of Chasiv Yar. We came to this based on this video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see two Russian soldiers that were trying to evacuate another wounded Russian soldier, and Ukrainians were attacking them with FPV drone. This moment took place exactly in this area, and based on this video we have adjusted these territories in Russian favor. Furthermore, according to several neutral mappers, the Russians secured the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal to the west of the settlement of Grigorovka. So as you can see now, the Russians are trying to improve their positions along the channel, along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. This will allow the Russians to concentrate additional forces, more forces in this area that can be used for further offensive operation in the western direction. Now let's move further. As for the Sivers direction, during the previous 24 hours, nothing special happened. When talking about the northern Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, Ukrainians announced evacuation to the west of the river Voskol. Lots of settlements were announced for forced evacuation. Ukrainians most likely are preparing themselves before the beginning of something huge. When talking about the northern directions, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and the most important, the Russians managed to secure huge forests in the vicinity of the settlement of Sadki. As for this direction, we see that the Russians are trying to advance to outflank the settlement of Yinakivka from the east. So this is the situation that was provided by several mappers. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.